Hey, we're live. Hi there, guys. This is Dane Dormio. Thank you for joining us on the Chai Tea Tai Chi web show. My guest tonight is not only very inspiring to me personally with his approach to business and life that incorporates martial arts, mindfulness, and peak performance coaching, which are all passions that are very close to my own heart. But he's also an accomplished martial artist, teacher, entrepreneur, and soon to be academic, not to mention having one of the most infamous names around. I'm really pleased to be sharing with all of you this conversation with my brother Rodney King. Rodney, how the hell are you doing?
Yeah, man, I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I, you're totally welcome, and the honor is truly mine. Considering that for me here, it's 10 p.m. on the first day of the year. For you, it's 6 a.m. on the second day of the year. So I'm really glad and honored that we have a chance to connect. There's so much. Um, about what you do that I'm really interested in, and is so much in alignment with the topics that we discuss on this show, and so there's just a lot of stuff that I want to ask you that I think our audience will get a lot of value from. And if anybody's joining us live and wants to ask questions in the chat or interact, we are certainly happy to hear. And um, I guess the hardest thing is knowing where to start. I guess there's I want to start with your origin story, and like where did you come from in your current incarnation?
Sure. Yeah. How long do you have?
Yeah, well, and that's a good question. And I know that you've written about this on your website, and you've
Sure.
produced tons and tons of content, and a lot of people already, from your speaking and coaching and other work that you do. So the short version, to just get us into the really meaty
Sure.
here and now alive stuff.
Yeah. Well, I can give you the Cliff Notes version, right? So,
There you go.
I was well, I live even now currently in Johannesburg, South Africa. So I was born in South Africa. Growing up as a child, I was brought up on the south side of Johannesburg in government housing. I guess the easiest way to explain what that is, it's similar to the projects in the United States. So, needless to say, I was brought up really poor and in an impoverished neighborhood. And like all those kinds of neighborhoods, a very violent neighborhood. So, not only did I have to deal with the gangs in my neighborhood, I had to deal with the schoolyard bullies. And so, most of my life growing up was really centered around anxiety and fear and just literally trying to survive. And that's one thing. I mean, when your outside environment is violent, but my inside environment, talking about my home life, wasn't any better. My mother was a raging alcoholic. She would fly off the handle for next to nothing. And in actual fact, she kicked me out of the house when I was 17. So I found myself sleeping on the inner city streets with literally nothing. I probably had like less than $20 in my pocket. And my usual spiel here is, what got me through that? How did I get to where I am? I pretty much put it down to the fact that I had always been involved in martial arts, literally since I was 6 years old. And had I not trained in the martial arts, I probably wouldn't have survived that time in my life. And I more than likely would have become just another statistic of failed parenthood in bad neighborhoods.
That's that seems like a pretty humble origin relative to where you are now, and there's there's a lot about that I can relate to, and one of the central things is being involved in martial arts from such a young age, because um, I basically wanted to be a Ninja Turtle as a kid, and that's like a lot of kids have. a lot of kids, almost all kids at that age, want to do martial arts, and there's I love that you attribute your survival to that, because it is that's a frame of reference that that many of us are not able to come from, of actual literal physical survival. But the certainly the desire to overcome the challenges of your upbringing, the challenges that you find yourself in, and rise to a higher level in life than that which you kind of find yourself appearing in, is something that I think a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, I think there's two things there, right? I mean, I always try to make this point, and just to be very, very clear, I mean, there was an initial attraction to martial arts where, like anybody, growing up, I used to watch those old Chinese kung fu movies. And the thing that attracted me most was this unassuming, who wasn't yet in the movie the hero, but would ultimately become the hero, who had no physicality, had no confidence, and ultimately through training martial arts, develop those characteristics, right? And oftentimes, especially in those kinds of movies, there was maybe like some bad guys that moved into his neighborhood. He didn't know how to deal with it. Then he heard about this master somewhere in a mountain somewhere, went off searching for the master, went to learn how to fight, because ultimately he thought that was the solution. The master, after time, actually taught him how to fight, actually how to use his physical skills. But there was always an underlining philosophy about martial arts being more than just about the fight. And oftentimes in those movies, the hero, the ultimate hero, who started off just looking for vengeance, comes back and doesn't want to fight. And this time around would rather find a better way and to deal with the situation and find a better solution. And only when push comes to shove, use the physical application of martial arts, right? And the reason I say that was the initial attraction for me. But then as I started to grow up, and especially from 6 years old onwards, where the bullying became so intense, that kind of shifted in my mind from that kind of idea of using martial arts as a life performance vehicle. Now, of course, at 6 years old, I'm probably not defining it that way and looking at it that way, but it shifted from that into more of a focus on learning how to fight. So, like it or not, I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out how to beat the bad guys. I mean, I wanted to know how to kick ass. I mean, that's the bottom line. And I think ultimately I ended up learning how to do that. I think my reputation, probably anybody who knows me in the world of martial arts, I don't think there's any body that would disagree that I haven't always put myself on the line, and I've always played a performance game, and I've always stepped up and willing to go, toe to toe with anybody. But as I've grown up and where I am in my life now, and what I've learned, especially over the last decade, I realized that initial thing that drew me to martial arts, the aspect of the life performance, I had lost it on the way. And I'd become so focused on the fight that I'd lost the art. And it took quite a lot of time and a lot of introspection and a lot of personal work on myself to finally be able to come back to that and to realize that ultimately that's what it was always about. But when you're young and you're in a violent environment, all you want to do is learn how to survive. The only thing you're thinking about is how to survive. And that ultimately comes down oftentimes, sadly, to the physicality and just learning the best way to basically dispense with another human being in front of you.
What a powerful hero's journey to set off and come full circle and arrive back where you started, and realize I've had the experience in my life that life kind of moves through spirals and cycles, and you see the same territory through new eyes at different times in your life. So the kinds of martial arts that you studied, you have a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and you've developed your own modern approach to martial arts that incorporates these physical fitness and performance and life enhancement aspects, as well as kind of tactical self-defense principles, if you will. And I'm curious what kind of what your general approach to martial arts is, and and just for kind of a framework, I started out in my martial arts journey very external. For the first 12 years or so was in external styles, and then I discovered internal styles, and I call this channel Chai Tea Tai Chi, and I use the term Tai Chi because it's recognizable, but as kind of the internal style. So I'm curious about what your where your martial arts journey has brought you, and how you see that distinction between the internal and the external in
Yeah,
martial
sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, look, when I started off in the beginning, like pretty much all kids at that time, or especially in South Africa, there weren't a lot of options as far as what you could do. So I started doing karate. I spent a long time doing karate. In short, I mean, ultimately by the end, when I decided to give it all up, I had a second degree black belt in karate. I fought for the South African Army military karate team. So when I was in the Defense Force and the military, I actually was part of the karate team. So I did that for a very long time, probably till early 20s. But at the same time, as I got into, high school, became a teenager, I started to realize that the kids in my school that people left alone were the kids that did boxing, Western boxing. So I started doing Western boxing. I trained for a very long time with a very well-known boxing coach here, Willie Tawil. He was a bronze medalist at the Helsinki Olympic Games. I competed in Western boxing, but I also competed in karate. And then when I went to the military, because at that time it was compulsory in South Africa. And I actually forged my mother's signature to get into the army early. So I entered the military before my 18th birthday. Once I was in the military, I found myself in the VIP protection unit. I ended up becoming a platoon sergeant. I was my unit's hand-to-hand combat instructor because obviously I had a background in martial arts and quote-unquote fighting. And then when I came out of that, I had heard about this thing called Muay Thai, and I wanted to learn. So I went to Thailand, and for the next decade, I trained in Thailand. And my primary Muay Thai teacher was Apidej Sithurun, who has now passed away, who was one of the most famous Muay Thai fighters of all time. He was the head coach at Fairtex, and at one point I was sponsored by Fairtex. I spent a lot of time with Apidej, and one of the very few people to be given permission to teach under his name, which has always been a huge honor for me. And so in those formative years of training, especially in my young 20s, I mean, I was pretty much teaching an amalgamation of karate, Western boxing, Muay Thai. I was probably known more for Muay Thai at that time. And then because I never finished high school and I had a military skill that nobody would employ, I had no prospects to get a job. And the only job that I could get was as a doorman, as a bouncer. So I actually spent several years of my life, which I'm not proud of, but it was a very important part of my journey as far as truly understanding interpersonal violence. So I spent these several years outside some of the roughest nightclubs in Johannesburg. Ultimately, I became the head doorman. I had over 70 doormen working for me. We ran several nightclubs. And so, needless to say, and it's not the thing that I normally talk about often, but I was in enough fights to know exactly what goes down in interpersonal violence. All of these experiences ultimately led me into other domains. And then it was, 1993, I believe, was the first UFC with Royce Gracie. I mean, we were very isolated here in South Africa. There was no such thing as, anything like that. There's nothing like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and stuff like that. So I was actually one of the first people to start Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because I realized, and, just watching the UFC, that had to be done. I saw it as an important part of learning how to fight. And still at that time, my focus was on the fighting aspect. That's what I wanted to do. So I started training BJJ. I've been doing it now, I think, for over 22 years. And my main coach, and I've trained with different people over the years, but my main coach is Higan Machado. And then, during the period of the early 2000s, I started getting really involved in MMA, mixed martial arts. Sports Illustrated here in South Africa referred to me as the father of MMA in South Africa. I had one of the first mixed martial arts teams. I put on some of the first MMA fights. MMA wouldn't probably exist the way that it exists here in South Africa had I not done that. And so I spent a long time, teaching and training in mixed martial arts. And then during this period and through the work as a doorman and all these other things, I started really thinking about developing my own approach, because naturally what was happening was I was finding myself in real situations and real fights. Not to say that I hadn't fought as a child growing up, but I mean, now as an adult, I was a lot more aware of those dynamics of interpersonal violence. And I started to realize that a lot of the stuff that's taught is just not applicable for those environments. And so I kind of, put my head down and worked out a way to actually develop the skills for that environment. And ultimately that became what I'm most known for, is Crazy Monkey Defense. And so that's still what I teach today. That's still the program that I'm most known for. We teach a huge spectrum of people, from the everyday person right through to special force military operators. And so coming back to your initial question, my focus these days is twofold. One, I still very much believe that if you're training in martial arts, you absolutely need to know how to utilize those skills in interpersonal violence. And obviously, there's a real world necessity for me, because I live in one of the most violent countries and cities on the planet. And so there isn't a student that comes to my academy that comes in there that doesn't want to learn how to protect themselves. And, if you just had to spend a week here, you would hear some horrendous stories of what goes down when we start talking about interpersonal violence. So knowing how to defend yourself is crucial. I still believe that if you're training martial arts, you absolutely need to know how to defend yourself. Second to that, and as important now, at least for me, is this aspect of life performance through martial arts. So taking the lessons from the mat positively into the world. And that's really important to me. And then I could argue for myself that everything else beyond that is secondary. So those are always my two main focuses as it stands right now. That hasn't always been the case. I mean, there was a time that my entire being and everything I did was ultimately only about the fight. I couldn't care less about anything else. All I wanted to learn was the best way to dispense with another human being, or human beings, especially, work in the door. You don't always have to deal with one person. You have to deal with multiple opponents. That's just the reality.
It's really interesting to hear that dissection of martial arts is about fighting and navigating the realm of interpersonal violence, and B, life performance enhancement, and it's just like everything else is frivolous, essentially, because when I came to a point where I really tried to distill what the essence of martial arts was, essentially it's the same place I arrived at. It's the interrelated study of prowess, which is how to use the human body effectively, and violence, which is how to cause injury and destroy the human body, to dispose of, I think, as he said. So that's what makes it a martial art. If it doesn't have both of those things, it's, if it doesn't have the violence aspect, it's a dance, it's a choreography, it's something else. If it doesn't have the self-development aspects, it's not a martial art. It's maybe it's a fighting system or whatever, but it's not a martial art in the true sense. So I really think this is kind of a universal theme that these things kind of the relationship between these things, and kind of out of the hottest fire, the strongest iron is forged.
Sure, yeah. I think there's a couple of things there, right? I mean, and again, I mean, I try to be very careful when I talk about this, because people get really angry and upset. I'm not sure why, unless there's some truth
emotional
to what I'm saying.
triggers. There's yeah.
Yeah, it's probably some truth, right? But the way that I see it these days is that and I can speak from my own experience because I come from a traditional martial art background, right? And so for a very long time, the traditional martial artists would often, and they still do, talk about this kind of philosophy, this healthy philosophy attached to the martial art journey. The problem that I found was that healthy philosophy is all good and well, but the bottom line is a lot of times what tends to be taught in the traditional martial arts does not cross over to the reality of interpersonal violence. It just doesn't stand up to the scrutiny of what it actually is to apply those skill sets that you learn in interpersonal violence. They just fall apart, right? And because there is a lack of functionality on that side of the divide, a lot of times the healthy philosophy just doesn't come to bear. It doesn't come to fruition. It's almost like because there's no functionality, it neutralizes the potential benefit of the healthy philosophy of the art. On the other side of the coin, there are, in this day and age, the combat athlete, competitive side of martial arts, mixed martial arts, and so forth, and also reality-based self-defense. There, especially in MMA, we could talk about reality-based self-defense, but especially in MMA, for the most part, if somebody's training properly, especially the high-level competitors, there is no doubt in my mind that these guys can fight. Clearly they can. And I would never argue that they couldn't, right? The problem that I see there is that they focus so much on the fight, so much on the martial, that they've literally dispensed with the art. And because they've done that, there's no denying that they can fight, but they've lost the life performance aspect of the martial arts. And there's a consequence to that, right? If you only live in the red road, if you're only living in violence, as I've realized in my own life, rather than becoming more calm, more focused, more centered, more mindful, you become less of that and you become more aggressive. You become, there's a lot more turmoil in your life. Now, you might be able to get your shit together for the fight. You might be able to get your shit together for the cage. But a lot of times you're going to find that kind of aggressive kind of statement doesn't just stay in the cage. It shifts over into your everyday life and oftentimes in a negative way. So my whole kind of, I guess my approach is, how do we keep it functional? Because like I said, I believe that, for example, if you look at mixed martial arts, no doubt in my mind, those guys can fight. So how do we keep it functional? But how do we still ensure that we, bring the art into this experience? Because then you have this balance between martial and art. I think I've said it there, is that the only way to do it is to make sure that you're training functional, because unless you're training functional, I don't think the art ever comes to fruition. I think then it's just kind of an intellectual masturbation. People can talk about it, but they don't really embody it. It doesn't really come into play into their everyday life, right? And so you have to be functional first, and then you have to set the intention through the functionality to want to actually achieve that life performance through the martial art experience. And that may mean that you might have to approach your martial arts training, even in the functional realm, from a very different perspective. In that sense, for example, rather than when I'm teaching, trying to get people to be aggressive and hung up on this kind of adrenaline-fueled, hyper-competitive mindset, I actually want them to be less aggressive, more calm, more focused, more centered. I actually want them to achieve mindfulness in the moment when somebody's actually punching them in the face. That's what I want, right? And so what I find then is that those embodied skills will cross over into everyday life naturally without me even trying to make the connection.
You said a really huge word there, mindfulness, which actually that's an area I want to go into, because I know that's a big part of what you do, and that's a big part of what I'm about as well. But there were two things, and in all of what you just shared, there's a lot of rich stuff there, but there are two really big things, this big flashes I had. One is when it comes to training something intensely as a sport, a competitive sport. Well, we know that typically, the typical window for age window for competitive sport athletes is pretty small, and it's from a certain 10 to 15 year period that people are able to engage in this activity, and then after that, nobody continues because by that point their body's completely torn up or whatever. Whereas one aspect of mind-body practices in general, including internal martial arts and many other things, is that you can go on practicing indefinitely and continue getting improving as you age, and so I think that's a really important dimension of the functional life performance aspect. Is this something that you're not going to burn yourself out and wreck all your joints by the time you're 30 or 35 or something? And then the other dimension, which maybe relates with the reality-based self-defense, and I use that term loosely because I know different people have different definitions of what that means. I have my own definition of what that means, and I'm comfortable with other people's definitions. But it's kind of, it can be a charged term, so I use it very loosely. But relating to exactly what you were saying about being more focused and calm and mindful and less aggressive, etc. One thing that I collect in my research is newspaper articles and news stories, headlines from the media for things like MMA fighter shot to death, MMA fighter or pro boxer or whatever, etc. Shot to death or stabbed to death or killed in armed robbery or killed in home invasion, etc. And there's lots of these headlines where somebody who obviously is able to fight really well and function in the setting of the ring still succumb to violence. So to me, that points to what you're saying about the way you approach your training and how what it's for and the effect that what it does for you, the effect that it has on you, and the way that you live your life and navigate the realm of violence and potential violence.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a part there, right? I think coming back to what you just noted about, say, for example, combat athletic athletes, whatever they may be, boxing and so forth, finding themselves in situations in the real world outside of the cage and losing, and getting basically getting beaten up or getting shot or so forth, right? There's a couple of things there. I mean, first off, when we talk about, I hate that term reality-based self-defense personally. I'm not a fan of it, right? Because a lot of times there's this kind of idea that goes around all the time about sport versus street and saying, well, those combat athletic guys, they train sport, but we train street. Those guys fight under rule sets. There's no rules on the street. And to some degree, there's some truth in that, right? Here's the bottom line. A combat athlete is far more in a position to be able to protect themselves in interpersonal violence likely than anybody that does likely than anybody that does reality-based self-defense. And the reason for that is that combat athletes actually play the game. They actually get in there, they spar, they fight against an uncooperative, resisting, chaotic opponent. So that's the first thing. Is that enough to be able to actually protect yourself out of the sport environment into the street environment? So in that sense, the guys that kind of perpetuate the reality-based self-defense stuff, sure, there is some relevance there. Of course, there are things that you're going to have to change if you're a combat athlete, and you're going to have to know what those changes are if you move your skill set into a self-preservation environment. There's a few things that come to mind, right? I'll give one example. When I'm in the academy and I'm sparring another human being, first of all, obviously, besides the fact that we've agreed to be there and there's rules and so forth, and obviously that is something that is prevalent in that environment, but that's actually not that important, right? I mean, if I can punch you in the face and I can land that punch, I can punch you in the throat. If I can kick you in the leg and I can land that kick, I can kick you in the groin. I don't see what the big deal is. I don't see why there has to be this mystical BS nonsense around self-preservation, right? If you can do it, you time it against a resisting opponent, you could place your techniques anywhere you need to. But when I'm sparring somebody in the academy, there is something there that's crucially different to what I'm going to need in a self-preservation environment. And one of those is where my attention is focused. Now, when I'm sparring one-on-one, all my attention is focused purely on that person in front of me. So my focus becomes very centralized. Doesn't seem like a big deal until you enter into a quote-unquote street environment where there might be multiple threats, if we think about multiple opponents. And now, because you've only ever trained to focus purely on the person in front of you, you haven't trained to have decentralized focus, and so you lose that ability to be aware of all objects in your environment. And that's something you actually have to train. It doesn't just come by chance. And so you actually have to put in training experiences where you get people who might be highly skilled in quote unquote sparring or the combat sports to actually know how and what to change in a street environment. And one of those is how you actually are aware of your surroundings, right? And awareness is a massive part of being able to be successful in self-preservation, especially of all things in your surroundings, which is not necessarily something that you would consider or even focus on if you were a combat athlete, where you are now purely focused on the person in front of you. And that's one example, right, of where the difference would be. But ultimately, my money would still be on the combat athlete winning a street situation than the reality-based self-defense guy. For one reason, most reality-based self-defense people do no sparring. They never train against a resisting opponent. And unless you do that, you don't understand systems thinking. You don't understand the complexity of what it actually is to go up against another human being who's not necessarily going to tell you what they're going to do next. And so when you spar, you are training adaptability, which is a huge skill that you require when you actually have to defend yourself. So I think those couple of points are super important, especially when we start talking about the aspect of self-preservation.
You mentioned awareness being a crucial element of that, and for success in the realm of self-preservation, and again, awareness or mindfulness. I think it's a huge element in everything, success in everything. And I'd like to ask more about how you see the connection between mindfulness and self-defense, and the and I eventually want to get into what is mindful leadership as well, but
Sure.
but maybe that would be a good segue into like that whole subject of mindfulness, and what's the connection between mindfulness and self-defense over and above what you've already touched on, and how does that lead into mindfulness in life?
Sure. Okay. Well, I mean, let's back it up a little bit. Why would we even be talking about mindfulness here? Well, there's a couple of things, right? I started realizing quite a while back that if you are completely present in the moment without, focusing on the future or holding on to the past, that actually is an incredibly powerful place to be when you actually have to perform at your best. And then realizing that was really important, having success with that in my own, martial arts journey, especially in sparring, because that was the one place where it was most noticeable for me. I started thinking about it more, and I actually decided that I would study it. And so my PhD, my doctoral studies, has been in mindfulness. That's what I've focused on for the last several years as a researcher and a social scientist. So I think the start off and give a simple definition of what do we mean when we say being mindful, because it is a buzzword right now. It is all over the place. When I started my research into mindfulness, it was still, I would argue, not so in the mainstream, but now it is. And so there might be a lot of misunderstanding and misconception about what mindfulness actually is. But think of mindfulness as a way of training your embodied experience. Most noticeably for most people will be through their thinking mind. So if I had to give a simple definition, I would say that mindfulness is the discipline of bringing your attention back to the present moment without judgment. That's the key element. Now, how does that have any relevance to self-defense? Well, here's the thing. When we start talking about being in a situation where I have to protect myself, where I have to defend myself, first off, I should have already done the work. I should have already trained and have developed the necessary skill sets to be able to do that. Then when I enter into any kind of environment, let's say, for example, in a foreign country, in a foreign city that I'm unfamiliar with, there is a tendency to be overwhelmed. And when you start thinking about, that the fact that you need to keep yourself safe, rather than being completely aware of the situation that is unfolding in front of you and being aware of your surroundings, oftentimes you may be kind of projecting into the future, so trying to think of maybe contingency plans, or you're holding on to the past, where you've been saying to yourself, man, shit, you know what I mean? I don't think I'm prepared for this. I don't think I'm going to be able to deal with this situation. And so you kind of never in the present moment. The fact of the matter is that when we talk about any kind of thing that arises, although when we talk about self-preservation, there might be what we could say, pre-violence or pre-fight cues. Of course, those do exist. But ultimately, anything that you're going to end up doing has to happen in the moment that it appears. And so the more you are present in that moment, the more you are able and capable of being able to deal with what arises. Because if you're not in the present moment and you're somewhere else or distracted, that could be, detrimental to your ability to protect yourself. I would argue that beyond that, though, is that when you enter into any kind of situation where there's potential for interpersonal threat and you are able to keep present, you are more in tune with your intuition. And so you're more aware of your spidey sense, is the way that I kind of try to explain it, right? And so you are more in tune with your body's natural intelligence that picks up on the environment and this kind of, this little voice that says to you, something's out of place here. But if right now I'm talking on my mobile phone when I'm talking to you, right? But I would argue that the mobile phone is probably the biggest threat to your safety. Because if you look at most people when they're traversing the world, even in dangerous places, they are so habituated and addicted to their mobile phone that they'll be in a place where potentially there could be a threat to their survival, but they're stuck to the phone. Now, if I'm on my phone, I'm not aware of anything else around me, right? And if I'm not aware of anything else around me, that when the situation arises, I'm definitely not mindful in that moment because I'm somewhere else. I'm mindless into my phone doing something else. And so when that arises, I may not even pick up on it. So there's just an example of every day, where people are stuck on the phone. I try to tell all my students all the time that you shouldn't be walking around the street, especially in Johannesburg, stuck to your phone. Because if something happens, you're not going to even notice it when it arises in your field of attention.
Something that you said is so huge. But I wanted to. I was wondering if you're able to lift or tilt your phone up because I think the top half of your head is getting cut off in the
there we go.
The live view. Want to make sure we can all see your beautiful face.
Sure.
That definition of mindfulness, that's so huge. It's I mean, and like many things that are so simple, it's so simple and so huge. The ability to return your attention to the present moment without judgment, because in so much of the teaching and the coaching that I do, it's a really common early challenge for people to overcome is first going from unconscious incompetence, where they don't know what their defects are, and then having their defects pointed out to them by a teacher, going from into unconscious or conscious incompetence. People often are conditioned to go into self-judgment. And with meditation and mind-body practices, noticing that you're not paying attention, people often are conditioned to go into self-judgment. So I love that you make that part of your definition of being able to return without judgment, because the judgment either takes you out again or prevents you from getting back in. So it's great that that's right in there in the definition, without judgment.
Yeah, well, we can't be present if you're judging. If you're judging your experience, if you're judging what's happening in your surroundings, then you are somewhere else, right? Then you're either in the future or in the past. You're not in the present moment. And so what you have to be is you have to learn to be fully present with yourself without judging both what is happening inside your own body and what is happening on the outside of your environment. And then what you start, like I said, you start to fine tune your awareness where your spidey sense becomes so much more attuned and you become so much more aware of things that are happening in your environment and picking up on subtle cues that you may have not noticed before. So from a self-defense standpoint, that clearly, if anybody that's listening to that would make sense that you would want to develop that as an integral part of a skill set that you use outside of just obviously knowing tactics, strategies, the physical components. That is, of course, important, but this aspect is equally important.
Yes, that's so powerful that you cannot be present and judging at the same time. I totally affirm that. It is actually there's not ever really a need to be in judgment, or if you do catch yourself there, the sooner you get back to presence, the better, because you cannot judge and be present at the same time. Absolutely. So besides teaching martial arts, you mentioned your PhD, which is in mindful leadership.
Yep.
And you do embodied performance coaching. So I'm curious also about your take on the relationship between martial arts and coaching, and what exactly embodied performance and what role embodied performance and mindful leadership play in that.
Well, I mean, I think it's a couple of things. Oftentimes it really depends on the audience. I mean, if we take, say, for example, mindful leadership as an example, I mean, a lot of times that applies as a coach to, you're always leading people. And so it's important, if you want to lead them effectively, if you can approach every experience from a mindfulness perspective, then you're a lot more open, not only to your own experiences, but to their experiences, right? Rather than coming in and always judging people beforehand, or having this kind of narrative in your head where you're trying to pre-plan stuff, you're open to the experience as it unfolds, right? If I have to define what does it actually mean to be a mindful leader, I would say that mindful leadership is purposefully choosing to become fully attuned to the present moment with clarity, poise, and equanimity. So that word equanimity, what that means is calmness and composure, especially in a difficult situation. Now, each one of those aspects are crucial to being a great coach, but they're also important to be an effective leader. If you want to lead people effectively, these ideas that I just outlined in the definition are crucial. And one way to develop those is through having a mindful perspective, or at least a mindful practice, right? So that you're practicing to be more mindful in everything you do. I mean, there are certain components that arise. I could give you one example that I think is very important, is that one of the places that I find both coaches and leaders, however you want to define it, I think, like I said, I think as a coach, you're a leader anyway, but let's say you were a leader of an organization, where most leaders fail in their leadership capabilities is in communication. And oftentimes it's because they're not fully there with the person that they're talking to, or while this person is talking to them, rather than being fully present without judgment to what's being said to them so they can be open to the conversation and the experience, they are pre-planning in their head what they're going to say as a counter argument. So rather than being right here, right now, they're already 2 steps ahead. And if you think of it like that, then that's not being mindful in communication. Your communication skills then become lacking because you're not fully present. So that's crucial. I would say from a coaching standpoint, that's equally important. Are you able to be with the student in front of you, fully present without judgment, and allow the experience to unfold naturally as it should? I would argue that a lot of teachers and a lot of coaches don't do that. Part of it might be because you want to try to get the best out of your students, so you try to kind of almost pre-plan what you're going to do next, which is important, of course. But I mean, once you're on the mat and you're with the person, are you there fully with the person, right? So these aspects of mindfulness then become important. So when you were talking about this idea of the embodiment of performance and so forth, what I'm always trying to do, not only in myself, but also with my students, is these ideas that we're talking about, I want to also teach them how to do that themselves. Because Most of my students, of course, are not instructors, right? These are people that come from every walk of life, like I said earlier in the conversation, but many of them work in organizations. Many of them might be potentially leaders, CEOs, entrepreneurs. And so the experience that they have with me on the mat and the, if we can call it the inner game tools that they learn, I'm really interested in how that crosses over into their everyday life. You know, I want to see that crossover into their everyday life in a positive way. And so my job, like I said earlier on, is one, to teach them how to protect themselves, because that's important. And then second to that is how to take those lessons from the mat positively into the world. And I think a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here is all relevant to that.
So I I'm actually just became curious about your coaching, and I want to find out how can people learn from you. I've spent some time on your website, Crazy Monkey Defense, and you've got an awesome course library there. It's just really incredible, and how much the range of resources that you have, and but you also are a peak performance coach. So how can people learn from you? And do people does somebody have to learn martial arts if for you to coach them? I mean, is that part of the deal, that they have to learn martial arts, or if somebody just wanted a peak to hire a peak performance coach, is that like a separate or adjunct service that you also do?
Yeah, no, look, I do all of it, right? Obviously, I'm most known in the world for martial arts, but I also do other programs where I integrate both my academic background and my research and all these other ideas that we're talking about. And so, for example, I've taught at Google, I've taught at Airbnb and several other, well-known companies where I've gone in and I've taught many of these ideas. And there's a lot more to it than what we've discussed, right? I actually have a methodology that I teach on how to achieve embodied intelligence, which ultimately leads to a embodied performance perspective. You know, teaching people how to integrate mind and body in the reality of the world. And now that doesn't mean necessarily fighting, right? But just the chaos of living, the chaos of organizational frame where things are unpredictable and things change rapidly all the time. However, I would say what makes my approach unique is that I could if I needed to, but what makes my approach unique is that I don't just, it's not chalk and talk. I don't just, sit there and just like basically talk to people and almost give a presentation or some kind of lecture. I don't feel that that's the best way to experience the things that we're talking about. What ultimately that I do is I want people to get up and move. Now, you don't need to be a martial artist to do that. You don't even have to have thrown a punch in your life. You don't even have to be fit. But I do want you to engage your body so that you can understand the tools from an embodied perspective, right? And so unless you can have that experience from an embodied perspective, it's not going to make sense, because you might be able to understand it from a rational standpoint. Cognitively, you can understand these ideas. But we're not talking about just cognitively understanding something. We're talking about embodying something, which means that you want to integrate mind and body. I don't think it's possible to integrate mind and body without movement, without applying the body. Now, it doesn't have to be martial arts. I mean, I could use any other movement discipline. I mean, I could use tennis. It doesn't matter. The point is, it needs to be some kind of movement discipline. And through the movement, you learn key insights about how your entire body is part of the process of achieving success. Because I would make the argument that most people are head heavy. They live in their heads. They think that that's where intelligence lies. And if I'm not thinking it, then it's not real, right? That actually there's an entire other language that we've forgotten, which is the embodied language. And the problem with that is that it doesn't lend itself very well to discussion. It's because it's pre-verbal consciousness. I mean, that's the way to describe it if I need to use an academic term, and so pre-verbal consciousness, meaning that the body is a different kind of language. We do understand how the body shows up in life through metaphor, as an example, But oftentimes, if you want to discuss it in a very simple way, because most people want simple solutions, right? Simple discussions, simple solutions. The 7 steps to, right? Unfortunately, it's not that simple. It's complicated, it's chaotic, right? And so you need a chaotic system that will teach you how to deal with the chaos and be happy with the chaos and learn to kind of immerse yourself in the chaos without being overwhelmed by it. And the only way to do that is through the experience of the body and through movement. And I do think that maybe I'm just biased, but I do think that martial arts is one of the better ways to achieve that.
Brother, everything you're saying is just so golden. Just aho. That's all I can say. It just this is so rich, and it's there's just this I feel like we're riding the same wavelengths in so many ways, especially relating to the integration of mind and body, because that's what my whole system and approach is about as well, integration of mind and body. And there's so much in what you're saying that's resonating. And
I will say this. I think this is important to say, especially if we're talking within the frame of the martial arts world, right? Is that I'm glad that you like it. I'm glad that it resonates with you. But I'll tell you right now that this is like a woo-woo subject for most people, right? And so it's just the truth. And if you talk to most quote unquote functional martial artists, I don't know why they still insist on using the terms martial arts, because I would rather say combat athletes. But if you talk to combat athletes or reality-based self-defense people, this stuff that we're talking about, they don't want to touch. They don't want to be involved in. Because in their mind, it's all blue light, hippie, hugging trees kind of stuff, right? I want to make it clear that, and this is something that I make very much part of my process, especially when I'm teaching and especially when I'm in organizations. Everything that I say, I make a point of backing it up with research as best as I possibly can. And if the research is not backing up what I'm saying, I tell people that, or at least give an idea of where it might. And so I want to try to, as best as I can, ensure that when I impart this knowledge to people, that it isn't just woo-woo, that it just isn't these kind of weird, kind of out there ideas. Because unfortunately, and I get where this kind of reaction comes from, especially in the traditional martial arts world, there's a lot of bullshit speak, right? There's a lot of rubbish nonsense that's talked about, and they say this and they say that, and I'm like, okay, I don't really care if you say that that's a truth. Show me where it's a truth. Show me where the research backs you up, because there's tons of research. Why not make the point of actually going out and finding where you can connect your ideas to research, because it just gives what you say more veracity and more credibility, right? And so anything that I'm going to put out as best as I can, I want to make that connection. And I think once people understand that, then this kind of, I guess, this tension or this, this kind of block, this mind block that people have to these ideas start falling away. But it's quite hard to get people to understand that, because unfortunately, in the combat athletic world, in the reality-based self-defense world, all they want to know is the best way to dispense with the human being in front of them. They want the best physical skills. And I get that, right? But as I said earlier in the conversation, I think there's going to always be a detriment to that. You might get that and you might be able to do it very well, but how does the rest of your life look? How does it look like outside of the ring, out of the cage? When you're not in the academy focused on ripping, somebody's face off and sticking fingers in the eyes and putting your mind in that place all the time, because if you like it or not, neuroplasticity exists. If you've got every experience you expose yourself to over and over again rewires you. Now, if just going back to how I was talking about there, clearly that doesn't sound very positive. Now, if you keep putting yourself in this kind of negative frame, even though, yes, of course, you need to know how to protect yourself, but if you're always putting yourself in the most dysfunctional way of experiencing it, you're ultimately going to start creating these pathways in your brain that are not just going to stay in the academy. They're not just going to stay just in the ring. They're going to infiltrate into every aspect of your life, because you don't just suddenly stop being who you are once you step out of these environments. You carry yourself around everywhere you are in the world. You are your body. Your mind and body is you, right? And so if you're creating changes in your brain in one place, it's going to show up somewhere else in another place. So now you got to decide, what kind of consciousness do you want? How do you want to be within yourself? Do you want to be hyper aggressive, pissed off, angry, negative all the time? You can become that through martial arts. I've seen people become that. I was that at one point, so I can fully understand how that experience unfolds, especially if you do it for a decade and you do it day in and day out. You're going to wake up one morning and be something that you didn't want to become. Or you can take a different approach and say, okay, if I'm going to step on the mat, what is my intention here? Well, my intention is not to become angry, is to be able to play the game without using this kind of fear-based perspective inside me, so that I am fully focused, fully present, fully clear, and that I do approach my experience from being calm, with composure, with equanimity. And then if I do that every time I step on the mat, I start to realize, actually, you know what? I don't have to be pissed off and angry to do this thing and to play the game and to play the game really well. And actually, it's a powerful place to be, that where you can actually be in front of somebody who his entire intent is on ripping your head off, and they're pissed off and they're angry, and then this kind of red mode, and you are just completely still in the moment and able to deal with it and walk off the mat and not even have it bother you ever again, while they sit in the corner ruminating on every mistake that they made, chastising themselves, giving themselves a hard time, and then come back on the mat the next day pissed off and angry again, and you're smiling. I mean, that's a choice, right? But you can create that choice every time you step on the mat. And I think that's a better way to approach it.
I appreciate so much about the approach you're sharing, because one of my personal aphorisms is martial arts should be more like a science and less like a religion. And I consider myself to be a martial artist and a martial scientist in about equal measure. So there's so much gold to be mined in this vein as well. We're at about an hour now, so I'm looking towards coming full circle. There's just a couple of burning questions that I have that I think our viewers are really going to appreciate. One is an aspect of I teach mind body mastery, which is actually mind body and life mastery, and an aspect of life mastery is personal organization and productivity. And as a guy who we didn't go into your entrepreneurial pursuits in depth, but I know you have your finger in multiple pies from what I gather, and just from the content you produce, the quality and quantity, it's obvious that you're that you have some effective systems and are effective at getting things done. So I'm curious about what are your personal productivity and performance secrets?
That's a good question. I don't even know if I have, to be quite honest. I mean, I just here's my attitude. I mean, I have an idea of where I want to go, and then I just do it, right? And so my attitude always has been is like, when you start something, finish it. I mean, it's as simple as that sounds, right? And that once you start something, be focused on it, get it done. I think oftentimes what people tend to do is, so it might seem like I'm doing a lot of different things, which I am, but in each one of those aspects of the things that I'm doing, I've defined specific things that I want to achieve, and then I set myself the goal to actually achieve it. So I get down and I actually do it. And I think what tends to happen with a lot of people is that they've got a lot of things, like they're stoking a lot of fires and they're doing 5% here, 5% there, 5% there, and they never really finish anything. So if I could give any advice to anybody is, if you're working on something and you feel it's important, finish that first before you start something else. Easier said than done, especially in this day of distraction. So, I mean, that would probably be my simple answer to that.
That's perfect. That's that's probably the best kind of answer there is, the simple one. And there's very rich veins to be mined there, and it's just so clear to me that we could have great conversation for hours. And
Sure.
But the thing that I most am curious about before we wrap up is, since we are entering a new year, I'm curious what you are looking forward to in the new year.
Well, look, I mean, I'm just continuing, right? I mean, I'm not a big fan of New Year's resolutions. I don't. Some people do New Year's resolutions and never do them. I'm just doing what I'm doing. I think if anything, I want to achieve this year is I want to kind of bring more to the forefront these ideas that we were talking about and make, especially in the martial arts world. If I can make an impact, I'd like to do this to get people in the martial arts world to understand that when we start talking about life performance aspects of martial arts, we're in no way saying all this kind of woo-woo stuff and, the blue light, and it's kind of like just out there. I mean, I'm all about keeping things pragmatic, grounded, attached to as much research as possible. And if I can show you that it can improve your game on the mat, most people are going to be open to how that might show up in other parts of their life, right? So, and when I say what I want to do is the life performance aspect more of what I do, it's not so much that I necessarily am trying to preach that to anybody. My attitude is just come in and train with me, have the experience. And if you have the experience and you feel positive shifts through that experience, and you find that just in the martial arts setting that your technique and your game is improving, I'm almost certain that you're going to just put two and two together and say, hold on, you know what? I can see how this stuff could play out in my everyday life. So if anything, if I have a goal for this year, I want to try to focus more on that. I've spent my whole life fighting, you know what I mean? That's my whole life. That's all I've ever done. And as I'm getting older and I'm getting grayer, it's becoming less and less important to me. And I think, if anything, what I'm most passionate about is that when I kick the bucket, when we're all going to, and I leave this planet, am I actually going to leave something of value? And I don't think just teaching people how to fight is going to mean much. But if I can impact people and change their lives for the better through my own story and through my own experience, because of, I've come through some rough times, and I know it's a cliche, but honestly, if I can do it, anybody can do it. And I really believe that. But there's some lessons to be learned there. And if I can impart those lessons over to other people and it changes their life for the better, that's a win.
That's the one of the hugest forms of impact you can have. What do people have to do to learn from you? Do they have to fly to South Africa, or what resources do you have available online?
Yeah, so I mean, I've got this. My main site for everything I do from the martial arts side, whether it starts when we're talking about courses and stuff like that, is at weaponizeyourbody.tv. So I've got a lot of online courses on there and downloads. Of course, I do have people that fly in from all over the world to come and train with me in Johannesburg at my academy. I do seminars all over the world too. We have a Facebook group. I don't remember the URL, but they could just do they could do a search for the Crazy Monkey Defense Facebook group. On there, all my seminars are listed, and so you can come to one of my seminars, and you don't need to be training with me or part of my group to train with me. Every August, we have a big annual training camp in Malaysia. A lot of people come down. Many people who don't train with us come down for the experience, because just they love hanging around with awesome people that are positive. And then I have a package too, because one of my friends, Aaron, owns a retreat in Rayong, Thailand. And so there are people that, if they want to train with me exclusively, but in a beautiful place in the world, they can come in and train with me for 5 days. And a lot of times when people do that, they focus on the things that we're talking about. Yeah, because I'm starting to find that, of course, there are still people who obviously come to me to learn, quote unquote, how to fight, especially when we are dealing with special force military units, law enforcement teams, and so forth. And naturally, that's important for them to understand that. I would make the argument that this life performance aspect we've been talking about, they actually tend to get it more than the martial arts people, which is kind of weird. But more and more, I find that people are coming to me because they want to understand the inner game components that I keep talking about. And how do you actually learn how to do that? And, what better way to do it than do it in martial arts through a martial art experience. And possibly, if they come down to Thailand, what better way to do it than do it somewhere where you're literally doing it in paradise? So there's lots of ways to connect with me and train with me. Obviously, I'm on Facebook. People can connect with me there. I do some virtual coaching sometimes, not often. So there's that option too for some people. So yeah, I'm quite accessible. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, you're all over the world, and you do some virtual coaching, but most of your coaching is in person.
Yep, pretty much. I mean, I prefer to do it in person, if I can. Obviously, I have a trainers program. I have people who teach my programs all over the world. I mean, I have people that teach Crazy Monkey Defense, and then my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu program, Monkey Jits, and some people just only teach my self-preservation program, which is called Weaponize Your Body. A lot of times those people tend to be law enforcement and stuff like that. But I've got people all over the world teaching my program. So if people can't come to me, they could go to one of my trainers. That's all listed on the weaponizeyourbody.tv site as well, if they're looking for somebody to actually go and train with.
Right. And there's speaking of that website, there's online courses there that I mentioned, and that's something that's a big area of fascination for me, is how technology is converging to change lives in many ways. And there is still kind of a gap where, particularly with martial arts training, that there's things you got to do in person. There's certain things maybe you can learn online or from books or videos and that sort of thing, but there's stuff you got to put your hands on and have people put their hands on you. So how much of your curriculum do you think it's feasible to learn online versus needing to train with an instructor in person?
Well, I mean, I think you can get a really good idea of what we do from the online courses, and it's up to motivation, right? Are you actually going to go and put it into play? Are you actually going to get somebody and train with them? But then, of course, people who join the trainers programs are in a completely different position, right? Because not only do they want to learn the material, they want to teach it. And I don't offer a distance version of becoming a trainer. I mean, you get an online, process where you can obviously use it as almost as a way to remind yourself of the material, and it just as a reference tool. Yeah, so it's a reference tool, but you have to train. And so there are requirements. I have to see at least each of my trainers once every 12 months, somewhere in the world. And unless they're in front of me and on the mat, and I actually get to see where they are, how they are improving, what questions they have, then they can't be in my trainers program, right? But of course, it's unrealistic and obviously not cost effective for people to come down here and train with me for extended periods of time, although they're always welcome to do that. And so, like it or not, you have to use what's available, and technology is a good way to do that, right? And so we've got the online curriculum for trainers, but that will never, ever be a substitute for actually training. It's a supplement. You actually have to come in and you actually have to train. So yes, I mean, it's there and it's good, but you have to come in and train with us as well.
Yeah, that's great. I really want to say that I'm really grateful for your generosity of spirit and all the work that you have done on yourself so that you can be of service to others. It's been a long road, obviously, and what you said about wanting to get this message out more, I want to fully support that. And I love your message. I love everything you're saying. I love what you're doing, and totally affirm and support your work. If do you have some links you can drop in the comments underneath this video for people to follow, for Facebook links or your website or whatever is best for you?
Yeah, I think like I said, the best one is probably weaponizeyourbody.tv. I mean, let me put that in. I mean, that's the best place.
If you drop that in the comments, it'd be awesome. What I've heard about the Facebook algorithm is if there's links in the description, it lowers the exposure. But drop those in the comments, and people will have a way to connect with you there.
Yeah, there we go.
I really appreciate that. I hope that the new year brings plenty of opportunities for us both to prosper and and support one another's vision. I feel like I and the rest of the world have there's a lot of value to be extracted from your story and your teaching, and I and the rest of the world have a lot to be grateful for. So
yeah, man, cool.
Not the least of which is being here with me this evening, or this morning in your case. So thanks a bunch for that as well.
Oh, cool, man. I appreciate it, man. Hopefully somebody, whoever's watching this finds some inspiration and get something out of it. And then, of course, like I said, they can always go to my site if they ever want to chat to me.
Beautiful. Thanks a lot, Rodney. Is there anything, any burning shares before we sign off?
No, man, I think I'm good to go.
All right, great. Then I look forward to staying in touch, and thanks a bunch for everything.
Oh, absolutely. Cool.
Bye.
Cheers, man.